Okay, I'm just getting this little live stream started. Hopefully you can hear me and see me. I know there's only like one of you here now, but go ahead and if you'd like, try to leave something in the comments so that I can see that everything's going well on your side and that you can hear my audio. Yeah. Okay, no worries. Hey, Carson. Carson, can you hear me? Is my microphone working fine on your end? Let me know. Okay, cool. That's awesome. Hi, Justin. Hi, Carson. Good to see both of you guys so far. We're just going to wait for, more of us to arrive. We still have about 8 minutes anyway, so no rush. But awesome. Good to see you guys so far. Okay, welcome to those that are arriving. We still have a few minutes till 4 o'clock, so just get comfortable, and I hope you have your viewing set up the way you like it. So about 5 minutes as we just wait for the clock to get to 4 p.m. Started this one a few minutes early. To anybody watching this in the future, you could probably skip ahead just a couple minutes, but you'll find the point where the lecture begins. Hey, Zach, how's it going? Good to see you too. Probably just going to get a lot of people arriving right, at the top of the hour. So I'm just being, just hanging in there. I see the numbers going up. Welcome everybody that's arriving. Hi there, Jerome and others. Good to see you guys. My clock shows 3:57, so just a couple minutes and then we'll really get into it. Okay, just a couple minutes now. Okay, welcome guys. Those that are arriving, good to see you. Just another minute or so before I get into the lecture. All right then, so we're basically at 4 p.m. now, so I'm going to go ahead and get the content basis of this meeting started. Welcome everybody here back to class, and it's good to see you. I hope you've had a good first week of courses overall this semester. And now what we're going to do is just basically continue through this live stream as I start to lecture to you guys about the fundamental concept of ethics, and we'll start to learn a little bit about one of the important ethical theories that gives a sort of framework for thinking about the concept of morality. So it seems we have about 14 of us that are present currently in the class meeting. Hopefully a few more will arrive, but for the time being, if you're here, feel free to go ahead and just say something in the chat. So that kind of gives me a record of your attendance. That'll be your like little attendance record. Some of you have already said a few things, and so that's nice. But just, feel free to say hi. All right, cool. Yeah, good to see you again, Jemin, Julian, Natalia, Mary Jane, Sandra, Nick, Rosemary, Jasmine, Jennifer. Appreciate you guys. Leanne, and all the others. Go ahead. Thank you guys so much. Not to worry, Jerome. Yes, I already saw you before. Good to see you again. Cool. So we've got our little group starting to form. Anybody arriving, feel free to say hi. That's just my way of keeping a record of attendance. Jasmine, Kristen, Elena, really great. So Uncle Borat, yeah, I like your screen name. That's funny. Zach, yes, hello. Okay, cool. Good. So today, as we all know, we're getting into our actual Tyler Ward. Not to worry. Thanks, Tyler. We're getting into our meetings. So we're going to really get started learning a little bit about ethics. As you can see, I have this whiteboard behind me. There will be occasions where I will use that to write out a few notes. On other occasions, I will type certain notes into the live chat. The live chat will be available when you replay the video later. So if you ever do want to go back and review your notes or look back to the content of the lecture, you'll be able to see both my written notes and also the student interactions with me. And I encourage you, as we're going through the meeting, if there's ever any kind of questions, comments, follow-up that you'd like to engage in, just go ahead and put something in that chat and I'll see it, and then we'll just respond to it live. So this is our live stream, and just kind of get comfortable with it, because this is going to be our format going forward for the most part. With a couple exceptions, we'll do a couple things on Zoom, like maybe the midterm review session or the final exam review session, but primarily we'll be located here on YouTube as we get through our class lectures. So I see our classes definitely all starting to arrive. Welcome back, everybody. To those just now arriving, feel free to leave one message or comment in the chat so that I have some kind of record that you were here. That's my sort of informal attendance record keeping. And okay, so good to see you all. All right then, so as you guys know, this class is called Philosophy 320, Contemporary Moral Issues. We're gonna dive into certain, difficult and controversial moral issues as we pass through the course. But the first topic that we really have to learn about is moral theory. All right, Jim, and you say you had a question about the essay. Are we allowed to get the prompt right now? No, not yet. My rule and my method that I've always used is to distribute the prompts about 2 weeks, maybe a little bit more than that, before they're due. And it would not make any sense for you to be able to get the prompt yet, because we haven't lectured on the material that is involving the prompt. So the answer is no. We're going to wait. We're going to wait until probably week 3 or 4, and then you're going to have the prompts, and then you'll have 2 weeks to work on it. Hi, Cayenne. Nice to see you too. Okay, so ethics, what even is it? You say no Zoom link? No, there's no Zoom link because the class doesn't go on Zoom. It's on YouTube, what we're doing right now. So there won't be Zoom, there will be YouTube. If there's going to be ever Zoom, I'll let you know and I'll inform you through Canvas, and I'll give you a posted announcement where you can follow the link. Office hours I'm going to do on Zoom, but I'm not going to do class lectures on Zoom. I'm using YouTube live stream. That's why I'm here. So, okay, good to see you all. Karen and all the others, good to see everybody. What's ethics? That's our question that we want to learn about. So let me tell you a bit about that. Ethics, it's a word that you maybe have heard in your life without having like an academic setting to contemplate it in. What ethics is the study of morality and moral concepts. So when I'm writing out notes, I invite you to, sorry for the little glare, I'm going to type that as well. I invite you to just sort of keep your own notes, whether it's on your notebooks or your devices as we go through it. So ethics, just to keep that clear. This is a fundamental topic of our class. I'm typing right now, so just give me a minute. Ethics is the study of morality and moral concepts. So when we think about moral concepts and when we think about morality in general, let me ask some of you, what do you think could be some examples of moral concepts? And to sort of give you a hint or something to just sort of prompt you a little bit, what are like two contrasting moral concepts where like one is on the sort of positive side of the moral spectrum and the other word refers to something that's on the negative side of the moral spectrum? Like we've got in moral terms, blank as opposed to blank. What do you think I could be referring to? Very good, Santino. What's good or bad? Sometimes when people look at actions, policies, state of affairs, they may say, well, this is something that's good, morally good. On other occasions, someone may see something and it strikes them as morally bad. So when we think about morality, sometimes we deal with the moral concept of good or bad. That's certainly one of them. What's another pair of distinctions that sort of has the same flavor or vibe? Nice and mean, I see you saying, Jerome, sure. Some people can be described as nice in terms of their temperament or character, kind or whatever. Other people you may say are mean, and that sort of seems to also express some kind of positive or negative moral valence. You talk about justice, Marina, yes. We could distinguish between justice and injustice. That's often applied to policies or the status quo, or a particular outcome of a policy. Someone may say that something that was done was just, or justice was achieved. In other cases, they may say an injustice was committed. You talk about love and hate, Mary Jane. I suppose, although those are a little bit more like emotional states rather than qualifications of what an action was, whether the action was done out of love or hate may kind of influence our judgment about its morality. But of course, sometimes people can do something through the attitude of love that's morally impermissible. So that's a little bit complicated. Right and wrong, that's a great example, Anthony. Right and wrong, yes. Morally right actions or morally wrong actions is just a common distinction that people do refer to. You talk about rude and polite, Zach, yes. That's also in relation to people's, I guess, etiquette in the way that they interact with others. How about this? What is the contrasting term that opposes the word moral? We have things that were described or thought to be moral versus actions that are, what's the other side of that? Positive and negative, you say, Jerome. Well, sure, that's possibly one way to look at it, but there's also non-moral senses of the word positive and negative, like there are positive and negative numbers. But sure, I understand what you mean. Immoral, yes, that would be the word I was kind of fishing for a moment ago, the distinction between what's considered moral or immoral. So we're already developing an interesting list of moral distinctions and concepts. There are some things that are qualified or thought to be right, some that are wrong, some that are moral, some that are immoral, just and unjust. Sometimes people talk about virtue as opposed to vice. Like, for example, generosity could be considered a virtue, or courage, whereas I guess greed or stinginess could be considered a vice. Sometimes people apply those terms to qualities of one's character. So anytime that we engage in these distinctions, when we judge an action to be either right, wrong, moral, immoral, good, bad, etc., that's when we engage in moral reasoning. Moral reasoning is when you or others or institutions make determinations about what is thought to be on either side of these moral scales. Now, to continue to expand on this topic, I want to tell you that there's three major categories or types of actions that are often described in ethics. So there's terminology that is used to refer to the three main types of actions in ethics. Let me put that right now in the chat. So three main types of actions in ethics. The first one are actions that are considered morally impermissible. Another, actions that are considered morally permissible. And then a third category that goes beyond just being permitted are actions that are considered to be morally obligatory. So, looking at these three different concepts or terms, let's try and figure out what they each mean and maybe come up with some possible examples of each one. To say that an action is morally impermissible, just based off common sense and your general understanding of language, what would you guess or think that that means? Saying an action is morally impermissible is just perhaps another, perhaps more complicated way of saying that it's what type of action? Morally impermissible, meaning what? Anyone can take a guess. Takes a little while for the chat to spit back the answer. Okay, not allowed morally. You give an example, Mary Jane, of murder. We'll come back to examples in a moment. First, the definition: not allowed, not okay, not excusable. Okay, those are all good interpretations of the word. I would put it in this possible way: morally impermissible acts are actions that are generally just described as wrong, or in other words, they're not okay to do. So there you see it. I typed it out in the chat. Morally impermissible. In other words, actions that are wrong, morally wrong, and they're not okay to do. So if a person does something which is considered morally wrong, the terminology that's often employed in ethical discussions or theoretical discussions of ethics is to say that it's morally impermissible. We're going to come back to that in a moment as we consider examples. Mary Jane, you're already kind of like on top of that. But hold your thoughts for a minute as I circle back to that in a minute. I want to consider the other definitions as well. So if a morally impermissible act is something that is wrong and not okay to do, by the way, saying that something's wrong doesn't mean that it's impossible to do. It just means that it's not right. Unfortunately, of course, people can and in fact do commit wrong actions in many cases, but they ought not to do it, at least in the moral sense of the word ought. So if a morally impermissible act is something wrong and it's not okay to do that, what do you think it would mean to say an action that's morally permissible? What do you think that could possibly mean? Now what are we saying? Actions that are okay to do. That's good, Anthony. Yes. So Santino, you suggest an action that is right. And I understand that because as we were just mentioning, right is the natural contrary to the term wrong. Marina, you say an action that's neither required or impermissible. People have the option to choose. That's an interesting and I think clear way to put it. Something acceptable, something that's okay to do and accepted, not morally wrong. Jim and I really do like the way you put it, not morally wrong. And let me make a further point about that. And an example could be self-defense, sure, as well as many other, almost infinitely extensive variety of examples. But let me put a finer point on it, if I may. So you're all kind of correct. An action that's morally impermissible is wrong. An action that's morally permissible is an action that is not wrong. And in other words, perhaps more informally, it's an action that is okay to do. So let me go ahead and write that out. Okay. So Santino, I noticed that you had written the word right as a possible interpretation of what a morally permissible means. And I generally understand that, but I just want to make one little comment about that way of thinking of it. The only reason that I prefer this statement, that it's something that's not wrong as opposed to something that is affirmatively right, is because when you hear the word right, it often calls to mind actions that have some degree of nobility or virtue or that are benefiting other people. And those, of course, are morally permissible. So, for example, if you donate money to a worthy cause, or you give blood for the blood bank, or you work at the homeless shelter handing out meals, or you help an old lady cross the street or put her groceries away, yes, those things are all morally permissible. But also, it's morally permissible for you to go to the park and fly a kite, even though that doesn't really have any impact. It doesn't necessarily change the world or improve conditions for anybody, but it's also just not wrong. So included in the morally permissible category are all the things you can imagine that are just not wrong, that don't cause harm, that don't violate any kind of moral principle. So that's why I prefer the perhaps less loaded term not wrong, but it does encompass all the things that we would generally refer to by the word right as well. And then we still have to touch on this third one. So what then might it mean to say that an action is morally obligatory? The word, I think, obligatory is a nice hint, but let's hear if you can think about what that might be. To say an act's morally obligatory, now we go beyond just being permitted. If it's obligatory, what does that mean, you think? All guesses are fair, or you could call it a guess or a reasonable inference. What do you think it means to be morally obligatory as an action? Something that you are supposed to be doing is what you say, Rosemary, or Tyler, that you should do it. Okay, good. That mandated, this is another good way to put it. Morally obligated, good, Jasmine. Yes, so all of these are correct. Obligatory holds as a word, a root word within it, the word obligation. And so, yes, that's the core concept here. As opposed to just being morally allowed, which is permissible, These are things that are morally like required or so, we might say. So I'm going to write that here. Morally obligatory, actions that one must do. And it would be wrong, in other words, not to do them. Yes, that there's some kind of duty involved. Yeah, that's a good, also a good way to put it, Marina. So we'll talk now about examples, but just to sort of give you a sense of the difference. When I talk about flying a kite as a morally permissible action, surely there's nothing wrong with that, and so it is morally okay. But it's not an obligation for you to fly a kite, like you can or you may not, but it's not something that we can say it's a violation of your moral duties if you don't do that. So keep that in mind. All actions that are obligatory are by extension permissible because you can't be obligated by morality to do something wrong, but not everything that is permissible is obligatory. Many of the things that we do, if I want to wear this sweater, I'm morally permitted to do that, but I have many other options in my closet, and had I worn those, I wouldn't have breached any moral duty. So hopefully that's giving you some kind of little more detailed grasp of the fundamental basic concepts we're talking about here. Let me just repeat again. We start this class just talking about, in general terms, what ethics even is. It's the study of morality and moral concepts. There's a long history going back in the West and really just globally talking about that concept. And in many theoretical discussions of it, it's divided into the three categories of actions that we're talking about now. Actions that are considered to be wrong, in other words, morally impermissible, actions that are not wrong, permissible, and actions that are obligatory or required. So now, having listed out and thought about the different definitions, I'd like to see us come up with some examples. We already had at least one earlier on the side of morally impermissible, so let's swing back to that for a minute. What would you say could be clear examples of an action or actions that are wrong? Even though sadly these actions sometimes do occur, it would be morally wrong for them to occur. So one was murder, and that's an obvious example that I saw written above. So I'll speak on that while others are maybe gathering their thoughts. Theft, another good example. Santino, surely stealing. And I'll take all these suggestions and give a couple of just brief words of comment. Murder, probably, that's one of the most grave moral misdeeds that a person can commit. Not to worry, Julia, good to see you here. I'm glad that you're now at the meeting. But yeah, as I was saying, murder, taking a person's life without proper cause. We're not talking about judicial execution or self-defensive killing, but rather, the killing of a person that was otherwise innocent and didn't deserve to die. A person's life is their right, and it's not yours to dispose of or destroy. As you know, your own life is something that you think is precious and that you safeguard with everything you have. So I would say murder is way up there, high on the scale of moral wrongs. But then there are other things, like you've mentioned, stealing, taking a property that wasn't given to you by like a gift or a transfer of ownership through sale. Obviously, people have property rights. And so we hope that our own property rights are respected by other people. So when theft occurs, this is generally thought to be wrong. Now, you give an interesting example, Jasmine, and I want to expand on that. I was just thinking the same. Now, when we give an example like, say, theft, and we say, generally speaking, it's morally wrong, I think that we can all agree that for the most part, people don't regard it as a virtue or something good to steal. But could there be an exceptional circumstance which justifies the typically wrong action? Like somebody has stolen a piece of bread because their friend is going into diabetic shock and they need to have some nutrition quickly. You don't have payment on you. And so in this moment, from a convenience store or something, you quickly take an item that can allow them to avoid passing out or fainting. You might say, okay, well, in this case, I engaged in theft, but it was an exceptional circumstance where that was called for. But the exceptions aside, generally speaking, yes, we can say probably that stealing is a generally wrong action. Cheating, yeah, another good example. Breaking institutional rules that are expected for people to follow in order to have an orderly system or organization. Let's see, what else? Kidnapping, surely that would be something wrong. Human trafficking, transporting people without their consent for purposes that generally are not to their benefit. Marina's question, when thinking of examples in this topic in general, how does differences in cultural and legal context play a role here? That's a good question that I was going to speak on just in a moment, but let me make a point about it. So we often think that cultural customs or laws establish what's right and wrong for a given society. And for the most part, law and custom does reflect a shared sense of right and wrong that a given community or civilization lives by. But often, the dominant perspective in philosophical studies of ethics is that there are right and wrong things that can transcend the culture, that there could be morally universal facts. So, like for example, um, if what was right and wrong was purely determined by cultural standards, um, it's often argued that there can often be like a cultural critique of an entire practice that a civilization engages in, even if they all jointly regard it as proper or moral. Can anybody think of an action or practice that had been legal, even in our country, but perhaps with the benefit of hindsight, it's obvious to most people living today that that was always wrong, even when it was accepted, tolerated, or protected by law? Any kind of practices or institutions that you would argue, or at least reasonably could argue, were being permitted but were wrong? I'm not thinking so much about abortion because the controversy surrounding the issue of abortion doesn't allow us to say in clear terms that it is wrong. Drinking, an interesting example, Santino, there was the era of prohibition, and prohibition was repealed. So perhaps during that time, the teetotaler movement thought that they were prohibiting something that was morally wrong, but then that changed. I was thinking more of the case of slavery. That's good, Brad. We got to reach a little further into our bag here to get some core examples. So slavery, using human beings as property, separating families and selling them from one owner to another, forcing them into bondage and servitude without, any kind of compensation for their work. Human beings, have a right not to be enslaved. And so there was a time, as we all know, in our country and many others, where slavery was a legally protected institution. But I would say that most people would not argue that for the time period that it was legal, it was moral. And it only became immoral when it was abolished under the Constitution. Because if it was moral until it was abolished, until the laws changed, then there would have been no basis for the change in the first place. You see, the better analysis is to say that, people recognized with moral perception that the status quo was itself improper. And if there was no distinction between law and morality, then we would never be able to engage in justified civil disobedience. You took the example of abortion. So, there are obviously states, some of these red states in our country now, since the Dobbs decision happened, which have prohibited abortion legally. But there are many people, as you know, in those places, under those jurisdictions, who may make the argument that the current status quo that prohibits access to abortion services is itself immoral. So there would be no room for a critique of a legal regime if law and morality were one and the same. Perhaps an even more clear example, think of this. Had you been giving safe harbor to like Jewish people during the Nazi Holocaust of Germany during World War II, you might have been violating the laws as they existed under the Nazi system. But most people don't regard those people as immoral individuals for having acted in violation of those laws, but rather having had a deeper sense of moral perception that allowed them to act in a way that was consistent with morality. Now, I don't want you to take it too far in the opposite direction and think that law and morality are never the same, and that we should just disobey and defy laws, because generally speaking, and for the most part, I think that they do align with some kind of shared sense of right and wrong. But the possibility for there to be things that are prohibited that are not wrong, or for there to be things that are wrong that are not prohibited, certainly does exist. A lot of people, for example, will take recreational drugs and don't think of themselves as evil or bad people, morally speaking. They think perhaps that the laws themselves are the things that ought to be changed. But this is a debate that we'll also talk about further when we get to the drugs unit of the course. Okay, so back to the bigger picture. I asked you first what could be some morally impermissible actions. And we said things like, murder, cheating, lying, stealing. I don't know if anybody did say lying, but that's certainly one that often is mentioned in general discussions of this. I would add a couple of other big basic ones: rape, torture, genocide, and there could be a whole spectrum of seriousness. Some of these, a little white lie may be particularly inconsequential and not very important, but genocide of like a whole culture or civilization could be something that's terrible and wrong on a high degree of immorality, even worse than maybe murder. But just giving you thoughts, food for thought. Now, let's move on to the next category. Saying that an action is morally permissible, we said, is to claim that it's not wrong. And I would hope that this will be easy for you to come up with examples of, because seems like we have a good moral group here. So you can just draw from your own experience. A lot of things that you've done haven't been wrong, I assume. So what is something random that you would argue is morally permitted? It's not wrong to do this. Helping those in need, respect, yes. Respect is less an action than an attitude, but sure, there's nothing wrong with having respect, obviously. Helping people in need, in a general way, sure. I would argue that's a fair example too. What else? Hmm. Stealing a loaf of bread to save my diabetic friend's life. Well, Anthony, we circle back to my own example. It's fair enough to say that, but I think uncontroversial, uncomplicated examples are better for the record, so that when people come back to this, they'll have like a kind of basic sense of it. But yeah, that's fair enough. We talked about flying a kite, riding your bike down the street, um, you know, taking a lift from your house to the airport. There's so many things in life that are not wrong. So it's easy for us to, I think, understand that there are examples like that. One last word I want to say about the previous little discussion, by the way. Yeah, the bike ride example, that's good, Zach. When we think about ethics in a theoretical discussion of it in a class in an academic setting like this, I always encourage students to think about themselves as the person who would legislate law, as opposed to the person who's subject to law. For example, suppose that you are a congressperson and a bill comes to your desk and it says federal legalization of recreational marijuana. How will you vote, yes or no? At that point in time, if you're casting the vote, you can't defer to a higher authority in terms of what the vote ought to be morally. You can't say, well, I've got to vote however the law tells me to vote, because you're literally the law maker. And in that case, you have to engage in kind of an independent, original judgment about what would be the right status quo for the society to employ, whether to have such a rule or not to have such a rule. So we, of course, are citizens subject to law, and we follow these laws for all kinds of good, moral, and also practical reasons. But when we think about morality from a theoretical perspective, we allow ourselves to think in the broader context as to whether even a law itself that was instituted was something that was good or bad on a moral basis. And we'll develop tools. Don't worry, I'm sure some of you are like, well, how could I possibly formulate an answer to that? We'll talk about theories just following this that help give some structure to the way we reason about morality. Marina, you ask, can we then conclude that what morally impermissible, et cetera, can change over time, since for the people at the time, slavery might have been seen as morally permissible? Well, some people believe in moral relativism, that moral standards can change. But again, I repeat, the dominant thinking in Western philosophy is that there is such a thing as moral facts that are objective. So primarily, most theorists would say that slavery was always wrong, and the people who believed otherwise at the time were incorrect. And then when a more morally enlightened culture descended upon the society, the rules changed. But they changed in accordance with an existing fact about slavery being wrong. I mean, saying that slavery was judged to be permissible at some point in the past is not the same thing as saying that it was actually okay. I mean, again, like women having no rights, including no legal claim against a rapist, that might have been a legal status quo for some time in the past as well. But we often believe that laws can achieve moral progress in the same way that cultural standards can. So I'm not discounting the idea of moral relativism, but it's really not something that features very heavily in the theory of ethics that we talk about a lot in an academic context. That's the best answer I can give on that. So we continue. Yeah, good. What about morally obligatory? This one sometimes takes a moment to formulate an example. It might not roll off the tongue quite as easily as what's like wrong or what's not wrong. But do you think you can identify any example of something that's morally obligatory, something that would be wrong not to do? I have a few examples I can offer, but let's see if anyone has some ideas on that. A morally obligatory act, contribute to society. The example with the bread. Okay, Tyler, I like returning to that. Let's get all these comments. Helping your family when they need help, sure. Driving under the speed limit, certainly a legal obligation. Some person might argue that under certain circumstances, there's no moral misdeed in surpassing the speed limit as long as there's no risk to any possible person. Like suppose that you're driving on an open road in the middle of the night. But the rules themselves, of course, exist to prohibit and prevent like accidents. And so there's some good reason for that. Not saying bless you after someone sneezes. Well, it is so informal and just related to etiquette that I don't even know if that rises to the level of a moral concept. We probably wouldn't say that if a person failed to do that, that they failed a moral duty, but that they just didn't live up to some kind of expectation that they would be more polite, following the law. Again, Jasmine, though, it's arguable that in some cases you have a moral obligation to break the law. Take again the case of slavery. Have you heard of Harriet Tubman? She and others helped to facilitate the escape of slaves through the Underground Railroad, which would be violating federal laws at the time. But this individual is not regarded as like a villain in history, but rather as like a heroic figure for standing bravely against the unjust status quo that existed at the time. So once again, as I repeat, I'm not trying to urge the idea, and why would I, that violation of law is generally a good thing. But you have to think about it in an independent sense and take it on a case-by-case basis if you're thinking about morality rather than just the rote application of rules to a given set of people. Going to church in a religious household, perhaps, but there are questions that some have as to whether belief in God is itself a moral obligation, because there are some philosophical arguments to the contrary that God does not exist. Save a person that you can save. Good example, Julian. Some people argue that the duty of rescuing a person from death, as long as it poses no risk to your own well-being, is a moral obligation. Take, for example, that I see a drowning child in a shallow pond, and all I have to do is extend my arm out to pull them up from there. Many would argue that if I failed in that, I would fail in a moral obligation that I have to the person because it doesn't really cause me any harm and it prevents their death. So perhaps saving a life is not example, but it has to be qualified, because if it puts your own life at risk or in harm's way, then many would say that I'm at liberty to decline to assist. The morality of AI, as a computer scientist, very interested about that. Well, I mean, it's something that can't be settled in a simple statement by me. There have to be moral arguments presented on either side. But I'm not sure. You'd have to maybe make a more precise formulated question, like in what way could there be moral challenges to the concept of artificial intelligence? I'm happy to discuss this, but just the general word AI, whether it's moral or immoral, like, do you mean like the applications of AI for society or the uses to which it is put? It's just a tool, is kind of my thinking as well, but it depends on the context of use and the application of it. I would say if a person's using AI to plagiarize, this is wrong, if that's what you mean. Or if somebody's using AI to generate intelligence that will cause harm to human beings, that can be wrong. But again, it could be applied in a way that's beneficial to people. So in the same sense as you argue, what's the morality of atomic bombs? I mean, the existence of the bombs themselves are highly destructive, but they could also be a deterrent to the use of violence against mass populations. So there's a whole thorny nest of issues to deal with there. We'll take our moral issues one by one as we go through the class. Yes, always good to have specificity, but all these questions are great. And comments too. Let me add a few words on the obligatory thing. So one interesting fact is that when you make a promise, you generate a moral obligation to follow through on the content of the promise, all else being equal. So suppose I have a friend that is coming into LAX airport on Saturday at noon, and they need a ride from the airport to their house. And they've communicated that to me, and I say to them, okay, not to worry, buddy. Like, listen, I promise you, I swear that I will get you at noon on Saturday. Now I made a promise. Once I make a promise, I created a moral obligation to follow through. But notice, and here again, we see a difference between law and morality. I didn't create a legal obligation to follow through. This is not enforceable as a contract. It's not as if I would break the law by not picking the person up. But I would do something that would be, at least in the moral sense, wrong. So suppose that they're waiting there at the airport on Saturday. It's 12, it's 12:30, it's 1 p.m. Finally, they call me and they're like, hey, I'm still here waiting curbside. Did you hit traffic or did you forget? Because remember, you promised you'd come and pick me up. If I say to the person, yeah, I know I promised you, but I didn't forget about it at all. The whole point was to just get you stranded at the airport. Sucks to be you, ha ha ha, and then I just hang up. Now, I didn't break the law, but I did something that was morally wrong because the promise itself establishes an obligation to follow through. So if you don't want to be obligated morally to do something, then you shouldn't swear a promise or affirm by that kind of oath that you would do it. On the other hand, the non-performance of what is obligatory is always wrong. So there's a logical link between those two categories, the morally impermissible and the morally obligatory. So as an example, we said that it's morally impermissible to murder people. Sure it is. So if it's wrong to murder, then it's morally obligatory to what? Just sort of the contrapositive. Morally impermissible to murder, so a moral obligation. Let's see if you can figure that one out. Yes, not murder. Yeah, to not kill. Okay, good. Well, not the same as saving someone's life. This is declining to perform the wrong action. On another example, if it's morally wrong to rape or to torture or to lie, then it would be an obligation not to do any of those things. And then flipping it back the other way, like we've said, if it's a moral obligation to keep a promise, then it's morally impermissible to break the promise. Other morally obligatory actions that are often thought to be obvious examples, perhaps care and support for one's children that they have custody over. Ordinarily, somebody wouldn't say, you're at liberty just to not feed them or provide for their needs until they're an adult. Taking the custody and assuming guardianship of a child often implies a set of duties and obligations towards them, not entirely different from that we have towards pets. If you take a pet in and you assume ownership over it, then you induce total dependence on you in the pet. So we would think that you'd have a moral obligation to like feed, house, and care for that until its natural life ends or something close to that. I would think also there's a moral obligation to provide payment for a service that's already been provided to you because it's an implied agreement. So if I go and I eat food at the cafe or restaurant, we would argue, I would think, that it's a moral obligation to pay, not just morally permissible to pay at the conclusion of the meal. And this can also, I guess, be considered a special case of not performing theft. Okay, so now, and then, yeah, when you accept a job, you're obligated to do it. Yes, unless this is a hitman's job or something else, but of course, just giving you some gray area to contemplate. Okay, good. So now we've just at least started to think about ethics in a little bit more of a detailed academic way. We're telling you that ethics is the study of morality insofar as we can think about it critically. And there are moral concepts that are familiar to many, all of us, which are like right, wrong, good, bad, moral and immoral, just and unjust. In ethics, then, in further detail, there are these three main categories of actions that are often discussed, as we've talked about. Morally impermissible acts, in other words, wrong, not okay. Morally permissible acts, permitted, meaning they are okay and they're allowed. And then morally obligatory acts, which one must do and it'd be wrong not to do those. And again, I repeat that we shouldn't assimilate the idea of morality explicitly to law. There's a large overlap between them, but we can think about it as like a Venn diagram where there's many things that are both moral and legal, but that there are sometimes cases of actions that are illegal but not immoral, and actions that are legal but immoral. Okay, so now we continue. As we discuss morality in further detail, we're going to learn about ethical theories. And an ethical theory is just a theoretical attempt to establish what makes an action either impermissible, permissible, or obligatory. So now some of you, I'm sure, are thinking, well, we've heard about these words, impermissible, permissible, obligatory, but what makes an action be one of those three things? And there have been different authors, important and influential writers in history, that have tried their best to devise a system that allows us to assign actions to these three categories. And each of these different theorists has a different set of principles and parameters that establish the boundaries of morality. So we'll start off by learning about one important moral theory, and that is the theory of utilitarianism. So I'm just writing that here. So one powerful and influential moral theory is the one that you see here in our chat, which is called utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is an ethical theory that was developed by some important authors a couple of hundred years ago, one of them being John Stuart Mill. And I'm going to talk to you primarily about John Stuart Mill's version of utilitarianism, because I believe his is kind of the most lucid and carefully argued. So yeah, John Stuart Mill, and by the way, he lived from 1806 until 1873. So I'm just putting that information here. John Stuart Mill talked about utilitarianism. Now, just a little bit of background on Mill himself. He's one of the authors, by the way, that is in the assigned reading, so we're now getting to that a little bit. Mill was a British philosopher and political economist. He also briefly served in the British Parliament for a while during his life, so he was also a lawmaker, at least for some time. And he's an interesting person in the sense that he had a diverse mixture of different views. On the one hand, he would be what we would call today political libertarian, meaning that he was a believer in limited government and maximum liberty to the individual, as long as that didn't interfere with the rights or interests of others. So for example, classical libertarian thought says things like this, that if you want to do something that is only concerning your own interests, whether it's advisable or not, we should permit you under the law to do that. We should tolerate you and give you the liberty to do so. So, for example, if a person wanted to take drugs or drink or seek out a prostitute or gamble, then the classical libertarian would say that whether you believe these things are virtuous or not, since they don't interfere with your well-being or self-interest, we ought to permit under the law for people to do those things. On the other hand, though, he would have also been considered a progressive politically by certain contemporary standards because he was an early advocate for worldwide abolition of slavery. As you know, during his lifetime, slavery still existed in many places, including our country, until partway through the end of his life, towards the end. And he also believed that women should be emancipated in women's suffrage, that they should be given the right to vote. So anyway, but the legacy that he left behind that kind of had the most influence is his writings and theories on utilitarianism. So let me just explain to you the basic concept of utilitarianism, and then we'll get into the details from there. So what utilitarianism says is to follow this major rule in all the things that you do morally. Okay, so I wrote there just a brief summary statement about the concept of utilitarianism. It's a theory that says the following: act always to promote the greatest amount of overall happiness for the greatest number of people. So it's all about maximizing aggregate happiness for as many people as possible. So if you had, let's for example, say a set of options and you're wondering what's the right thing to do. And it's like option A, B, C, and D. The utilitarian theory would advise you to act this way. They would say, well, estimate how much total happiness would be the result of each of these possible actions, and then simply act in accordance with whichever one would give the greatest overall. And then that becomes, in this scenario, your moral obligation. So your moral obligation at all occasions, according to the theory, is to simply do whatever that would generate or maximize utility, some call it, or pleasure/happiness, others call it. Now, about the utilitarian idea, it's a member of a family of theories that are called consequentialist. And that means I'm going to have to tell you next another piece of vocabulary. What is consequentialism? So consequentialism is an umbrella term that groups under its span utilitarianism and a few other ethical theories. But what it overall says is that the morality of an action depends on the consequences that follow from the action. So there you see the definition printed in our chat of what consequentialism means. It just is the idea that whether an action is right or wrong, in other words, morally permissible, impermissible, or obligatory, what that depends on is the nature of the consequences that result from the action. So consequences, we should just think about them as like the effects of what you do. You may have heard the word consequences in your life and attached a more negative connotation to it. Like somebody may say, will there be consequences if I plagiarize my paper, or etc. But we mean it in a more broad and neutral sense. There can be positive consequences of an action or negative consequences, but the nature of those consequences will be definitive as to the moral status of an action. So just in a random example, suppose that you had a friend and you know that they have a big exam coming up tomorrow, so you help them prepare, you help quiz them and work with them on flashcards and stuff late into the night. So the next day they arrive to their exam well prepared because you helped assist, and they pass it and they ace it. So that's a good outcome, a good result that followed from your decision to do so. So we may say that had a sort of positive set of outcomes or consequences. On another occasion, maybe somebody has the same kind of friend, but instead they stay up with them the previous night, drinking and partying, so they barely sleep, and they come in hungover to their exam, and they perform very poorly and fail. You may say, well, that's a negative consequence that results from this other potential action that someone had done. So what consequentialist ethical theories always tell you to do is to direct your focus ahead towards the possible or probable outcomes of what you're going to do. And they tell you to simply gauge the morality of your actions by what those likely consequences will be. To the whiteboard really quick, just a little kind of diagram or drawing to help make that somewhat more memorable. This is just a little stick figure drawing, but suppose that this here is a person and they perform an action. This arrow is just going to stand for the passage of time. After the action is performed, at the tail of the arrow, I just draw the letter C, which I'm kind of highlighting like that. Let's suppose that this letter C stands for the consequences that materialize after you do the action. To the consequentialist, it is these that are all important in determining the moral status of the act. So utilitarians are one brand of consequentialists because they agree that it is the consequences that determine the morality of the action. But to the utilitarians specifically, which consequences matter are the consequences that bear on overall human happiness for all affected by the act. So once again, if you wanted to live in the ethical framework of the utilitarian, then you would always be making these forward-looking prospective judgments about what possible consequences would follow from your acts, and you'd simply try to act towards those actions that would generate the greatest yield of total happiness for all affected. Now, there are some underlying principles that Mill provides, which are supposed to make utilitarian ethics seem even more plausible or well-based in common sense and reason. So I'm going to offer to you one of the big principles that he gives to the reader to try and, again, indicate that utilitarianism is intuitive and reasonable. So one of those he calls the greatest happiness principle. So the greatest happiness principle of John Stuart Mill simply says this, that actions are right, meaning morally right, to whatever degree or extent that they promote happiness, and likewise, actions are wrong, morally wrong, to whatever extent that they promote the reverse of happiness. So there you see it in the chat, Mill's greatest happiness principle. This is supposed to be one of the pillars of support that helps to prop the theory up and make it sound reasonable to any reader. If you're wondering, well, why would I think utilitarianism is correct? Mill hits us with this principle. He says, well, doesn't it seem true and common sense that when you do an action that generates happiness, then how much happiness it produces is what we will say is how good the action was. And on the other hand, suppose that you do an action that promotes the reverse of happiness, then the more pain and etc. that it causes, then the worse and worse that the action is. Now, at this stage, I'm sure some of you are wondering, and I'm going to help you clarify this. You may be wondering, well, they keep talking about happiness. Try to create happiness and don't create the reverse. But what does that mean? Isn't happiness something so ambiguous and subjective that we don't have any kind of common understanding of it? But Mill and other utilitarians actually don't agree with this. They think that there is some kind of general and shared concept of happiness that can be put forward. And here's what they say that it is. To the utilitarian, like Mill, they just define happiness in these terms, that it is pleasure and the absence of pain. Pleasure and the absence of pain, happiness, in other words. So when something happens that causes a person to experience pleasure, this is causing happiness. Or if it removes pain that otherwise was experienced or would have been experienced, then this can also be considered equivalent to happiness. Now, if happiness is pleasure and the absence of pain, then I'm thinking that at least one of us, but probably more, will be able to reason out the definition of the reverse. If you just flip that around, what would we have? Instead of pleasure and the absence of pain, the reverse of that is what and what? Once you get it, then I'll type it in the chat to make it official. But let's see if you can think about what that might be. The reverse of pleasure and the absence of pain is blank and blank. Namely, what do you think? Just kind of switch these terms around a little bit, and then you'll get to your answer. But I'll just wait a moment to see if you can provide me with that one. Yeah, so no pleasure and pain, good, pretty much. And you say suffering in the presence of pain, Jerome, pain and suffering. Yes, these are all roughly on point. I'll just summarize it with an even more precise statement. And that's very good, Jasmine. That was actually the exact wording that I was kind of trying to get to. pain and the absence of pleasure. That's the reverse of happiness, at least in the terminology or usage of these writers. So pain and the absence of pleasure. Okay, cool. So what Mill then, now we can return to the greatest happiness principle with a little more depth and understanding because we've clarified these related terms. What it says again is that actions are morally right to whatever extent that they promote happiness, but also actions are morally wrong to whatever extent they promote the reverse. In other words, when you do something that causes pleasure for people or removes pain from people, then the more and more pleasure that is caused or pain eliminated, then the better and better we think the action is on the moral scale. On the other hand, if you perform an action which causes pain or removes pleasure that people otherwise would have or were experiencing, then that's worse and worse depending on how much pain you caused with your actions or pleasure that you destroyed. So I'll just give you a random example that maybe will make sense. Suppose that there was like a house on fire, something not totally unrealistic. As you know, there's been a lot of fires happening in the Southern California area, LA especially. But anyway, suppose that there's a person who happens to be on the scene of a burning home. And they see that there are people trapped within the house. So they make a heroic attempt to rush into the house, opening a corridor so that the people who otherwise could not have exited safely can now exit and saving their lives, basically. So we're talking about a person who prevents their death by smoke inhalation and burning, saving their lives. So if the guy that did this saved one person, you would think they did a great thing because let's go through the example in terms of the definition here. Whatever horrible pains that they would have suffered in the immediate sense of burning or inhaling all that smoke has now been avoided. And consider further that all the future pleasures that otherwise would never have been attainable for them are now still possible for them to enjoy. I mean, God forbid, but suppose something terrible was to happen to you today and your life ended. There are so many things lying out ahead in your future that you wouldn't be able to enjoy or take pleasure in, whether that's graduating college, I don't know, getting married, having children, exploring parts of the world that you've never been to, seeing a film that you're waiting for it to be released, and going to events, concerts, festivities that otherwise, would be eliminated had you died now. Those things are all lying ahead in your future. So to save the one life, of course, you've done a great deed. But if it was 2 people, 3, 5, 10, the numbers just add up. And the more and more pain that is prevented or pleasure that is secured, the better and better we think the action is. On the other hand, let's take the opposite example. Suppose we refer to the arsonist who set the fire in this hypothetical example. I'm assuming there is one. If this person, by setting fire, causes a house to burn somewhere where people trapped inside burn to death, then they've done the opposite. They've caused the pain to the person that has died, but they've also eliminated their access to all future pleasures. And if you did that to even one person, it's a horrible, terrible thing because how precious life is. But if you killed 5, 10, 100 people in this building, it's just making the action worse and worse, isn't it? Because the consequences now in terms of how much pain was caused or how much pleasure that was destroyed are adding up. And taking it outside the scope of this one example, if you have like a genocidal dictator that just kills millions of people or something, then you could say this is a supreme form of moral misdeed because we're stacking up just greater and greater levels of pain, misery, and the elimination of happiness. But if somebody invents like a new novel cure for a disease that was harming a whole bunch of people, and that then results in a whole bunch of people no longer suffering from the disease and having their lives extended, you could say that they have sort of opposite moral characteristic, and that would be considered positive. So anyway, I'm just giving you some like kind of parameters for how utilitarians think. They say that we should focus on the consequences to determine whether our actions are right or wrong, but then they make it a bit more specific by saying that the relevant consequences for morality are those that have some impact on pleasure and the absence of pain. So to whatever degree you cause pleasure for people, remove pain, you're doing something good. To whatever degree you cause pain for people or remove their pleasure, you're doing something that's bad. Now, to make the theory a little bit more relatable, I next want to kind of walk you guys through a simple little exercise, and we'll just do this using our whiteboard. I often will use a real world scenario to help make a little bit more obvious how the theory could be applied, like in a practical case. Okay, so we're just going to test out the way the theory is applied by using it to think our way through like a simple choice situation that people can face in life. So for our notes, we're going to create a box like this box. And in the box, we're going to have 4 vertical columns like so, and 4 horizontal rows like so. So now that's creating a grid of 16 boxes, okay? Now, to the top 4 columns, I'm going to place 4 items of info associated with each of the 4 columns. And what each of the 4 things is going to be listed here is going to be a different type of possible pizza topping variety, okay? And I know you've all had pizza in your life, so you're familiar with what I'm talking about. Let me just see anybody here in the chat who could call out like one common and well-known pizza type. People order sometimes this type of pizza. Which one? Let's see if you could just throw that out there. So I see pepperoni. Let's go with P for pepperoni. I don't know if that's an easy to read letter P. Let me try it again. P, first column, pepperoni, okay? I see another person that has listed cheese. So we're gonna put C, letter C for cheese right there. Okay, pepperoni, cheese, pineapple, the always controversial pineapple, but why not? Let's add it. P, lowercase I, to distinguish it from the pepperoni, which has already been assigned letter P. And then one more, I don't know, let's see, what could it be? Supreme. I see Supreme coming multiple times, but it's a little unclear to me what all exactly it is. I know there's different types of Supreme pizzas. Let's go with them maybe mushroom, I suppose. Why not? I'm just keeping it simple for the time being. Now, here we have 4 things. Pepperoni, cheese, pineapple, mushroom. Okay, 4 types of pizza. Now, to the left 4 horizontal rows, we're just going to add the name of 4 students that are here in attendance. And for you to participate in this, if you're one of these 4 people that you want to help me with it, you're not being asked to do anything weird or just complicated. At the end of the day, I'm simply going to ask you how you would rate the pleasure of each of these different toppings personally from your point of view. So I just need to have 4 volunteers, and let's see if I can get anybody that's ready to do that that can just confirm it here in the chat. Let me see, and then I'll put that person's name and include it on the chart. It'll just take us a moment. Okay, Tyler, you're 1, so that sounds good. Okay, one of us. Jasmine, all right. It's a little awkward me writing right now with this thing because I'm at a strange angle, so not to worry about the penmanship. Jasmine, Tyler, okay, let's say Jemin, and then Leanne. How about those 4? To others, thank you guys for your willingness to participate, and we'll definitely have more opportunities later. Okay, but for now, you see here then a grid with open boxes at 16 positions. Each box now can be associated between a name and a pizza topping type. So like say, for example, we're looking at this box that would represent Tyler mushroom, or this one, Leanne pepperoni, okay? Now, for our little exercise, we're just gonna generate a certain range. We're just gonna stipulate that the range is between 0 and 50. And when you give me a number, what you're definitely going to be meaning is that that number stands for, like, let's just pretend, the quantity of pleasure that you would experience if that was the choice that had been made of pizza topping. So everyone's different, you know, my favorite pizza might be gross to you and vice versa, which is totally okay. But we're just using this for the purposes of illustrating the parameters of this ethical theory. So again, as 0 through 50 is the range, to be clear, if a person said 50, that means that that's like kind of maximal. So they really, really enjoy that. If they have no pleasure associated with that choice, then it might be a 0. And then there's all the shades of gray in between. Suppose that you like one of these to some degree, but not as much as another, then that should be reflected in the various scores that you assign to them. So suppose that you like pepperoni twice as much as cheese. Maybe pepperoni receives 40 and cheese receives 20. Or maybe you just don't like pizza that much at all in general, and so all 4 toppings kind of receive mid or lower scores. But that's for us to determine by just going through the example of each person. So I'm going to go from top to bottom. So to the 4 people that have volunteered to help us out, I just want you to start kind of formulating in your mind right now your thought about the pleasure score, as it were, that each of these would get from you. So we'll start off with Tyler. And if I could, let me know what you're thinking about the pepperoni question. If it's pepperoni, 0 through 50, what are you thinking in terms of your level of enjoyment of that? Okay, you going with 35. A nice kind of upper, above average value. And we're just going to keep going through. So the next one is cheese. What is cheese in your perspective when we go to the same range of scores? 15. Okay, it's a big drop, but it's still some pleasure. It's just less than half of what pepperoni gives you. Pineapple. I feel like this will be one that we'll see. I guess I can't prejudge. 25. Okay, right in the middle range. Some people just hate it. Some people love it. You're kind of a little bit neutral about it. That's okay. And then the last one is the mushroom, and that's 20 for you. Okay, good. So they're all to some degree pleasurable, but as far as Tyler's concerned, pepperoni is the one that he enjoys the most, and that's fine. Okay, so we're going to go to the next person listed here, Jasmine. Coming back to you, we start with pepperoni, and so what number are you going to throw out for that? Okay, another 35 coming from Jasmine for the pepperoni option. No problem with that. What do you say to cheese, though? Cheese gets 40 for you, so we're going up the pleasure scale just a bit. A little more enjoyment coming from that type of pizza. Now we ask about pineapple. What are you saying for that? 20, okay. A little bit of a decline, but not all the way to 0 or anything like that. Fair enough. And then one more is mushroom. So yeah, let me know. What do you think? 30, okay. So we're getting back up into that mid above average range. Okay, thank you so much for that. We're moving on to Jemin. So we got to know what you're thinking first on pepperoni, and let me know. 35 for that one. Okay, fair enough. Seems like you guys have a similar view about that. What's the next one? Cheese is also 35. So for you, there's no real difference in terms of how much enjoyment. You could take or leave either one, or I guess with equal interest. And the next. Pineapple. Loading. Okay, if it was just pineapple, 13. If it was pineapple and ham, like over the maximum. Okay, well, I guess as written, we're going to go with the pineapple alone. I mean, it is kind of, I guess, normally associated with ham, but let's just go ahead and wait, 48 is the last one. Let me get clarity on this. We're talking about 13 for the pineapple by itself, and then 48 on mushroom, or no? Let me know if you can say in the chat to clarify. Just got a little confused. Oh, 48. I know what you mean now. You had a value that was over the maximum. To the last thing then, mushroom. Okay, 25. Just in the mid area. Fair enough. Okay, and now we come down to Leanne. Let's know what you think about the pepperoni variety of pizza. Okay, 0 for you. No pleasure on pepperoni. Okay, that's a good, bold perspective. Cheese gets all the way up to 50, just a maxed out variety of topping for you. You're liking cheese a lot. We ask about the other two. Pineapple gets 20, and then we come to the last. Mushroom, what's the case there? 35, okay, great. So now the grid's all filled in. And remember, what's the rule of utilitarian ethics? It says to take whatever action that will create the most happiness for the greatest number of people. So in the given scenario we're looking at here, we have a set of 4 people. Let's suppose that one of them has been appointed to make the choice for all 4 as to what pizza topping to get. Now suppose this person's also a utilitarian. So what are they going to do? They're going to try to select whichever of these 4 is going to produce the maximum yield of total pleasure for all that are affected. So that means we have to do a little bit of simple arithmetic. What do you think is the mathematical operation that we have to do next to formulate the right answer here, or determine the right action morally from the perspective of this theory? We simply have to Addition, correct, Mary Jane. Yes, we have to add these 4 columns, these 4 vertical columns, and what we will have at the bottom of each is a sum of those 4 values. The sum will then represent numerically, let's suppose, the amount of total happiness or pleasure that pizza selection would result in for the whole group taken as a group. So check my math, but we're going to do that. So 35 times 3 is 105. Okay, here we have 40, 55, 60, 90, 140, if I'm getting that right. 140 because it's, again, 50, 85, 100, yep, 140. Okay, 45, 65, 75, 78. This one. And then the last is the mushroom, so that's 20, 50 plus another 60, so that's 110. Right, 30, 50, 60, 90, okay, 110. So in this scenario then, based on the outcome of the math, there's one of these choices that dominates the others in terms of maximizing the total amount of happiness for the group, and it's which one, can you say? If we're a utilitarian, we are now morally obligated, they can say, to select cheese, correct. And why? Because it simply is the choice that results in the greatest overall amount of happiness for the whole group considered as a group. There's a word that's used in more modern discussions of utilitarianism. Mill didn't employ this word, but in the generation since him, the word has sometimes been added to the vocabulary of the theoretical discussion, and that's the word optimific. Optimific is just a sort of technical term. What it refers to is which of the actions within your set of options that would uniquely maximize utility. So in the scenario here, using this word, we would say that cheese becomes the optimific action. So if this is the 4 people, then more pleasure is going to be caused for the group considered as a whole in selection of cheese than by the other alternatives. But it's important to remember a couple things. Utilitarianism, although it's based on pleasure, it's based on the maximization of aggregate pleasure to all affected. So does this selection make everybody as pleased as they could be individually? No. Some people are here, like, say, taking one for the team, as it were. Tyler especially, I guess, is taking one for the team because in his view, this is like the least desirable pizza topping, but it's still the one that, considered with respect to the whole group, is generating the most total utility. So occasionally within utilitarian ethics, a person may be called to perform an action which, though it doesn't maximize their personal pleasure or happiness, still generates the greatest overall yield when considered as just one factor in a bigger picture. Now, if you're doing things by yourself or with a different group, then maybe the calculus can change because it doesn't relate to the pleasure of other people. If I'm alone and I'm trying to decide what I want to eat, then certainly I would probably just choose whatever makes me the happiest because it doesn't implicate anyone else's interests. But when other people's interests are related to the choice, then the utilitarian always advises us to count everyone equal and none more than one, and to simply act in accordance with whatever would generate the greatest overall amount of utility. Again, utility expressed in terms of pleasure in the absence of pain. Now, I've chosen an action here that is, of course, not a very morally charged action. This is not exactly life and death, war and peace. It's just choosing pizza toppings. But I use it as a template for you to understand the general framework that a utilitarian would apply to any choice. So, like, going back to a maybe more complex issue, suppose that you were that legislator and the bill now at your desk is federal legalization of recreational marijuana usage. If you're a utilitarian type legislator, then you would think through things in this way. You would anticipate the total pleasure to all members of society if the law were either approved or defeated. And then if, in your judgment, one or the other would lead to a greater total happiness, then that would be the one that the utilitarian theory would advise you to do. So far, making decent sense to you guys? Any questions about just this point? Just helping you to think about the application of the theory to, like, at least one real world scenario. Now, I know in real life, we don't like assign number values to the amount of pleasure that we experience for things. And so in real circumstances, it'll be a little less mathematically precise how to make such judgments, especially when there are close calls. But the utilitarian just says, try to do your best. You know, don't be completely unconcerned with total utility as you make the choices that you do. But yeah, if you have any questions about that, I would love to entertain them. But that's the main thing I just wanted to put forward by this example. And I mentioned again that it's not limited to trivial or inconsequential cases how to apply the theory, because if you're a utilitarian, then all moral decisions, large and small, should we drop the bomb, atomic bomb, or should we withhold on doing that, like going back to maybe World War II era? All decisions, even those that have a huge and powerful impact on life, death, well-being, health, safety, could be made in utilitarian terms. Now, when we come back on Tuesday after the weekend, we're going to finish our notes on utilitarianism. I just have a few extra comments to make to you. We'll talk about what have been called some criticisms of the theory, because my first move is just to sort of make sure the theory comes through clearly to you so that you can understand its basic concepts, and to make it sound somewhat plausible, to take its best shot, as it were. But in philosophy, a common thing that we always see is that there are theories and views, but then there are objections and criticisms to those same things. So we're always going to have balance in this class as we go through it, and that's a common theme in philosophy. So we need to know about the theory, which we're learning, but we also need to know what critics and opponents would say as to why they don't think that this is a good theory, or what they find faulty or implausible about it. Because certainly, as many people have found this to be reasonable, there have been some powerful objections that have been raised against it too. And so I want you to be able to have a full picture of that so that you can understand why it's attractive to some, but why it's also considered problematic, at least to some others. And your own view, of course, is up to you. It may be somewhere in between, or you may find it extremely convincing, or you may be more moved by the objections that we'll speak on when we kind of wrap this up on Tuesday. After we finish with the notes on whatever remains here about the objections, we'll transition to another moral theory that is considered the major competitor and rival to utilitarian ethics, and that's the writings of the German philosopher Immanuel Kant and his duty-based Kantian ethics, which has a much different system and a set of basic principles. So that's kind of where we are right now. We're running low in our 75-minute period, and I don't want to keep you guys beyond 5:15. So let's just do this. To those that are here, maybe some of you didn't arrive earlier when I said feel free to say hello to give a record of your attendance. But if you're here now, and even if you were here earlier, feel free to say goodbye because we're signing off. And once I see enough of you in the chat that have done that, then I'm just going to end the stream. And this video is going to appear on this YouTube channel as soon as it uploads. So you'll be able to come back to this and review it later if you'd like. But we do have live meetings. So these are synchronous classes, but you get the benefit of having a record of it digitally later. Okay, thanks everybody. I see all you guys here in the chat. It's awesome. Good first meeting. Hopefully it worked for you. The instructional modality of YouTube Live, personally, I find it very good and effective. But I'm hoping that you had a good experience. So thanks again, guys. Great to have you here. Feel free to sign off, and I will see you back on Tuesday at 4 p.m. here, same place, same channel. If you haven't done so yet, feel free to subscribe to it, and then you'll get notifications when we are live if you ever forget or whatever the case may be. But for now, have a great weekend. Take care, and thanks for all your participation. For office hours, yeah, Jim, and about that, I'm going to post a Zoom link for my Monday office hours, and I'll do that over the weekend. Each weekend, I will post it, and you'll just see it in Canvas announcements in the day leading up to the Monday 4:30 p.m. office hours. Okay, and for appointment, you'll have to email me on that, and then we can set that up anytime. Okay, once again, guys, take care. Thank you so much, and I'll see you soon.